began to doubt and criticize Paul and Silas and Timothy. It could have been that, but we don't know. It could have been that all the hostility that we read about in Acts chapter 17, where they basically, the Jews stirred up trouble and assaulted the house of Jason and finally more or less ran Paul and Silas out of town, or they were taken out for their safety. And so it's possible that hostility had continued, and they were able to have some influence on maybe their brethren or their friends or their those that they knew that possibly were just circulating and causing trouble still and had created doubts. And it could have been, we don't know, it could have been that they're in that pagan culture and influence, and all these folks being many of them, leading Greek citizens and prominent women, that they felt peer pressure, and that was causing them to doubt or to criticize. But anyway, essentially in chapter 2, Paul is making a defense, giving clarification or answering anticipated questions or real questions or whatever the situation was. Paul is dealing with that. I think we could say, apart from the fact that this is the inspired word and that it's given by inspiration to the Apostle Paul, just from a human standpoint, I think we'd have to say that this is pretty brilliant, isn't it? In the way that Paul presents this. And Brother Harkrider mentions in a short comment that Paul, he takes advantage of the fact that not much time has passed and everything should be fresh in the minds of all these folks. And so Paul begins to say to them, as you know, they should remember it. It hasn't been that long. It should be fresh in their minds and it should be important. So we pointed out before that the structure of Paul's defense here is to more or less say, we're going to discuss this, we're going to address this, and you're going to be the witnesses. And so he says in verse 1, for you yourselves know. In verse 2, as you know. And we went over some of those and then in verse 5, we never came with flattery, as you know, and God is witness in verse 5. Then in verses 9, 10, and 11, which we're going to deal with in just a minute here. But in verse 9, for you remember or you recall. And then in verse 10, you are witnesses. And then in verse 11 in the King James, New King James, and most translations, some of the translations have this in verse 12, but in verse 11, for you know. And so it's really noticeable, isn't it? Don't you think it stands out that this is the approach that Paul is taking? So anyway, let's read verses 9, 10, we'll just go ahead and read through 9 through 12. I'll read from New King James, which most of you use, I believe. For you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, we preach to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you. As you know, how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you, as a father does his own children, that you would walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. So we'll just kind of walk through these last 3 or 4 verses. Again, we'll maybe define some of the terms, but not in too much detail. But so when Paul says you remember or you recall, he's relying upon their past experience and knowledge. If this had been live, so to speak, if Paul had been before them present, and he began to speak as he is writing here, what would have been the reaction? I guess I'm asking for an opinion or a thought. What do you think would have been the reaction of those folks when he begins to say, and as you know, and you remember? What would they have done? You think they would have? What's that? Right. Yeah, they would almost had to say, well, amen, or yes, that's true, or that's correct. They wouldn't be in any position to say, no, that's not the case, would they? Because it was so recent. So anyway, it just kind of helps it all to sink in, I think. So. If he said you have forgotten something like that, then people were going to take offense. Yeah. But I think too, you have to look at the Greek mindset as they were lovers of knowledge. Mm-hmm. They had advanced the world greatly through mathematics and mechanics and things. So these were lovers of knowledge. But he's just not going to say, you know these things. Mm-hmm. He's not, as you say, he's not trying to put them on the defensive ring. He says, you are aware of these things. So recall what I have taught you before. That they would be more receptive to that. Yeah. Right. Yes, Dick. Yeah. That man, if he doesn't walk by, had no company with him. Right. Those are hard sayings. Paul wasn't flattering in the things in which he bragged on. He really meant what he was saying. He wasn't flattering. Right. Anyone else? Well, you remember, and of course the inserted here in the middle of the sentence, at least in most translations, this expression of earnestness and tenderness and directness, brethren, or brothers, or brothers and sisters. Paul throws that in there. They knew about his labor and toil, and the point of that is that we work day and night, that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim the gospel. I don't know exactly what that means. You have to wonder, did he make tents at night and preach by day, or did he preach at night and make tents by day, or was it a mixture of both those? And what did Silas do, and what did Timothy do? We don't have any of that. But anyway, in some way, Paul thought that the way to express it was we labored and toiled. That is, it wasn't just regular work, but it was strenuous work. It was, your translation may say it was travail, or it was a hardship. It was extra work. That's just so they wouldn't give the wrong impression and be a burden to anyone, and put a spot on their reputation, so to speak, in their eyes. Any comment, anyone? So anyway, that's the first point that he makes there, and this is all going to lead us into what we called last week the second illustration that Paul gives in this little section to us, but that they might not be a burden to us. Now, this is information that we don't really learn from Acts in the account there. It's related to some information that we studied in Philippians chapter 4, I think it's verse 16, where Paul said that to the Philippians that once and again, or twice, or more than once, you sent relief to me, or aid to me, or help to me. I've forgotten the term that's used there. But you sent to me in Thessalonica. And so at some point, Paul did receive some assistance from the church in Philippi. But they worked day and night. And then, if there's nothing further on that, the verse 10, you are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct. So he says, or you're witnesses to our manner of conduct. And this, now this was not conduct specifically as to reputation among outsiders, was it? We set the right example. We had the right attitude and conduct with reference to you who believe. That is, you who had accepted the truth and were being taught the truth, and we behaved in these three, with these three characteristics. And the first one is holy, or it might say devoutly. The idea seems to be that they claimed to be, and they were, religious men. They were men of God, and godly living was important to them, and it was obvious that they lived up to that expectation. So they were godly or holy men. They were righteous or just men. That would mean basically that they were predictably fair and honest, trustworthy in their dealings with other people. Again, as comment was made a little earlier, they weren't using trickery or flattery or anything like that. They were fair and honest, and that related to their general conduct and possibly to finances. But then the third thing is they were blameless, and that again I think has to do with their overall reputation. We protected our reputation there. It was important for them to do that. So anyone want to add anything on that? Yes. Well, yeah, it could be. I hadn't thought of it that way. In Brother Weaver's commentary, he started out on that phrase by saying he didn't think that the fact that Paul in other cases, 2 or 3 other cases, said day and night, he didn't think that the sequence here of night and day had any significance, but maybe it did. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Says, in weariness and painfulness. He uses these same 2 Greek words, but now it's weariness and painfulness, not just labor per se, but even greater strain and stress on him in all these sufferings that he experienced.
Yes, Dick.
Is this the same word that's used regarding a woman when she's in travail having a baby? Is that not the same word?
Not the second word, no.
In the English, it's the word travail. It must be a different word in the Greek.
I don't know about the verb now. I'd have to look and see if there even is a verb off this word.
But anyway, they were witnesses. Paul says, this. They had to agree with it, and of course that all gives force to if if the first part of verse 1, or the last part of verse 1, if his proposition is that our coming to you was not in vain, then all that he's been saying to this point just demonstrates that, doesn't it? It did some good, and it wasn't wasted or it wasn't empty. Then it goes on, for you know how, this is, let's see, that's the ESV. In New King James, as you know, verse 11, as you know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father does his own children. Let's just look at those briefly, those terms first. Exhorted or exhort, I don't know, I guess it has kind of an elusive definition, but in general it can mean to advise, it can mean to call to the side or stand beside someone, I guess, figuratively speaking, in the case of speaking to them, but to stand beside someone and to advise or instruct, kind of a general meaning as I understand it. Anyone want to put more with that? So he said we exhorted, and again, exhortation or exhorting can mean encouragement or comfort, but since he uses encouragement and comfort in the second place here, I think probably exhortation is meant to mean something else there. It's if you look at if you use an interlinear or look it up in Vines or whatever you do, if you look that up, you'll probably find it has this prefix of para or para, as in paraklesis, paraclete, the Holy Spirit, paraclete, parakletos. You see that word para or para used a lot of times, and so this exhortation or exhorting to encourage and comfort and instruct is actually kind of kin, I guess you'd say, to the idea of even the word used to describe the Holy Spirit. But anyway, they exhorted, and then he says we comforted. That's the King James. I believe some say encouraged. What else? Anyone see a different word there? There's a little, there may be overlap, but there are at least minor differences in these three words. They exhorted, they comforted, they encouraged those who were weak or faint-hearted, who were discouraged and needed to be lifted up, and getting a little stronger. And it's meaning they charged or they challenged or they maybe even admonished. Most of us have heard at some time in some place, the difference between exhortation and admonition. That exhortation is to call to the side and kind of speak as needed, to advise, instruct. Admonition is more the idea of speaking into the ear and putting something into the mind of a person, especially if it's in the form of a mild rebuke or a strong persuasive advice. Trying to convince someone that they need to do something, and so that's the idea of charging there as it's used in the King James. But anyway, they exhorted, comforted, and charged, and there's something here again, if you have it in verse 11, it depends on your translation, but whether it shows up in verse 11 or verse 12, he charged every one of you. And Brother Harkrider made a point that kind of brings out something subtle there that I don't know if we're not careful, we'll probably miss it. But whether he says every one of you or each one of you, you just have to, if you stop and wonder what that might mean, I suppose it means that if they needed to preach publicly, Paul or Silas or Timothy, they did. If they needed to teach and do these things, to exhort, comfort, and charge privately. If they needed to talk with one person or a family of people, you wonder what kind of activity was going on in the few weeks or whatever the time was that they were there. But again, that's kind of subtle, but he apparently deliberately uses the word every one of you or each one of you. And then he compares it to a father trying to help his children. Does a father always speak to his children as a group? If he's got 5 or 10, does he speak to all 5 or 10 of them? No, he speaks to them a lot of times individually, doesn't he? So that may be a point to notice there. Comment?
Just because each individual has different needs.
That's right. Yep. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and move on, try to get this finished and get to the questions then. But here's the illustration of the father. After using the illustration of the mother and her tender care and affection, and an image or a picture comes to mind when you think about the mother and her dealings with her children. And Paul reminds them that that wasn't all that was involved. That you witnessed this also. So now he's describing the father. The fatherly figure, and maybe the picture of authority, and whatever the father needs to do, but it's done out of care and love again, isn't it? But all this was done then in the latter part of verse 12, that or so that in order to that you would walk worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Anyone remember Philippians 1:27, where Paul used the word worthy? He wanted them to walk or live as citizens in a way that was worthy of the gospel, didn't he? To conduct themselves. And we kind of talked about that there. The term is used in Ephesians 4:1, we may be more familiar with, where Paul said, I beseech you, brethren, to walk worthy of the calling or the vocation wherewith you are called. And, probably a couple other places. But anyway, when we talked about worthy, in at least in Philippians, possibly in Ephesians 2, Ephesians also. But when we talked about worthy, we said basically, it doesn't generally mean it as we sometimes use it to mean deserving, does it? I mean, I guess it could mean that in a few cases, but most of the time it means a way that is fitting or becoming or appropriate or corresponding to expectations. So he wants them to walk in a way that is becoming of their profession to be followers of God. And I think we mentioned if you follow the meaning of worthy back far enough, you find that it's related to the word worth. And worth, of course, kind of expresses the idea of weight or value, doesn't it? And I don't know if you remember, we used the illustration of the balance, and where a standard is put on one side of the balance scale, and then the action or the conduct or the commodity is put on the other side of the balance scale, and then those two things are supposed to balance or correspond with each other. Now that meaning probably had faded by this time, when Paul used the word, but that going back far enough is kind of the idea behind it. Yes. Good, thank you. Anyone else? This expression is at the end. We can all study it. I take that, whether it says calls you to or unto, into his kingdom and glory. I take that, especially in view of the overall set of thoughts and theme in 1 Thessalonians. I take that to be a reference to the eternal kingdom and the attendant glory at the coming of Christ. Now, I don't know. It could be that it's broader than that, and it's something to get a little involved. But if anyone has a comment on that, we'll be glad to hear it. Okay. Well, we should be ready then for the questions on. Lesson 15. They're on page, I believe, 72 and 73 in your workbook. These are a little bit scrambled, and they're based on the wording is based mainly on the King James translation. So now Jane's not here, so someone's going to have to speak up to answer these. So. Number one, at what place was Paul shamefully treated or spitefully treated? Philippi, yes, or Philippi. You might think, well, what difference does that make? But Paul is just kind of building up to his logic, isn't it? He's saying it wasn't in vain. And then in the second verse he says, after they'd been shamefully treated or spitefully treated in Philippi and gone through all that, they weren't discouraged, but with courage and boldness, they came right on to Thessalonica and preached the gospel there. Number two, what was Paul willing to have imparted to them in addition to the gospel? Verse 8. Right. Yeah, not only were they ready and willing to preach the gospel, but they were willing to sacrifice and offer their very lives themselves. Could be a reference to threat and danger. It could just be a figure saying we gave everything, or we were ready to give everything. Number three, why did Paul say they labored night and day? Right, good, thank you. Yeah, so as not to be a burden to any of them. I guess it'll come up in the thought question. I said we'll say it started to mention Corinth, but we'll get to that in a minute. Number four, Paul said that their exhortation or their appeal was not from what, or didn't spring out of what, or didn't grow out of. So that's in verse 3. Three things. Right, error, uncleanness, and deceit. We talked last week about guile, I think, guile or trickery, there on the third item, impurity of motive, possibly, on the second item, and then where it has error, some translations may actually have deceit there. Number 5, how did Paul and his companions behave themselves while among the Philippians? Verse 10. Three things mentioned there. Right. Yeah, and again, it varies a little bit, but those three things that we just talked about a few minutes ago are pretty obvious in meaning. It was their behavior, their conduct, living as they ought to live, even among those believers whom they had taught. What comparison did Paul make in describing how gentle they were in dealing with the Thessalonians? Verse 7. Right, yeah, the picture of the nursing mother loving and caring for her own children is the first illustration. And, they could have been less gentle. They could have been more authoritative. They could have been more assertive, even aggressive, perhaps. They could have been more demanding. They could have asked for financial support, but Paul says, no, we didn't do any of that. Number 7, what 3 things had they done as a father does for his children, which we just discussed, but 3 things. Yeah, they exhorted, advised, instruct, encouraged or comforted, and they charged or implored or admonished, whatever was needed to prepare the people to live in a way that was consistent with their being led toward the kingdom of God, toward the eternal kingdom. Instruct. Yeah, the terms vary a little bit from one to the other, from one translation to another. Number 8, Paul had been bold to speak the gospel amid what in verse 2? They came to Thessalonica from Philippi amid what? Yeah, much contention or much opposition. And of course we can verify that from Acts chapter 17. Right. Anyone else? Then number 9, which we just read a minute ago, unto what had God called the Thessalonians? I'm not sure, but I don't remember how the original King James read there. I don't know if that should say had there or not, or if it does. Well, let's go ahead and answer the question. He had been called, or he called them, or was calling them into what? Yeah, unto his own kingdom and glory. And I don't know. I mentioned, maybe shouldn't have, but I mentioned the timeless present last week in connection with verses 3 and 4. And I'm not sure that applied there, and I'm not sure it does here. But this may be a case of that. You see that usually when it's something that gives the nature or the character, the attributes of God or Christ, that are eternal or permanent in nature. And so he could be saying, God calls us. That's what he does. He continues to call us day by day and year by year, even all the way to eternity. And so you can study that. Number 10, who were Paul's witnesses concerning their behavior in Thessalonica? Yeah, they themselves. He starts out with saying, you yourselves know. And so that gives you a little clue. Anything else on those questions? Let's see. Okay, we'll go to the true and false quickly then. Number 1, true or false? Paul used flattering words a few times. That's false, of course. Number 2, Paul sought personal glory and was sometimes burdensome to the Thessalonians. Yeah, not at all. That's false also. Number 3, Paul's entrance to Thessalonica had not been in vain. That's true. Their entrance or their coming, the work they did there wasn't a failure. It was effective and successful, was it? Number 4, Paul had been allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel. That's the wording from the King James, I believe. That's true. And number 5, Paul exhorted the Thessalonians to walk worthy of God. That's true. This thought question, I guess, should be pretty much self-evident or obvious. But Paul labored night and day at Thessalonica, verse 9. Did he teach that preachers must never be fully supported by the church? Give scriptures if you can. So what do you think on that? Well, of course, we know at this point that that's not the case, is it? It's fairly lengthy reading, but we could go and read a large portion of 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and the logic, the argument that Paul presented there and the illustrations that he used. You shall not muzzle the ox that treads out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his hire. All those kinds of things, and he goes to great lengths only to say that he declined to take support from Corinth, for the sake of, I guess, appearances or influence, the threat of possibly having an ill effect upon his reputation and his efforts in Corinth. He said no thank you to the Corinthians. Instead, he received wages from some other congregations. There are several others, some of them kind of only clues or hints. For example, when the first missionary journey began and Paul and Barnabas were sent out from the church in Antioch, it says that they fasted and prayed and sent them out. Now, on the second, third journeys, I don't know if it mentions that they sent them out, but what would you think is implied by the statement they sent them out? And over in 3 John, I believe it is, when it talks about receiving certain teachers and sending them on. What does that mean? Doesn't it carry the idea of of assistance or aid, financial support or food or whatever might be needed? Well, that's, of course, all of that's kind of a broad subject, but anyone have anything else to add on that? We're not going to get too far into lesson 16, but we'll go ahead and unless someone wants to add anything before we go on. What we have in lesson 16 is Paul coming back now to commend the Thessalonians again, as he had in chapter 1. Now, in chapter 1, he commended them for imitating himself and the Lord in their belief. So they became followers of Paul and followers of the Lord. And then they kept on making progress, and their influence began to be felt throughout Macedonia and Achaia and to the areas to the east and the west. And so they were commended for all that. Now, in this lesson, Paul is going to commend them in a time of suffering or persecution. That's kind of hidden in here till you really look for it. But apparently they were under some pretty heavy persecution. So he's going to commend them for their endurance in the face of persecution in the very same way that the churches and the Christians in the province of Judea had endured in the face of their persecution. So that's kind of the gist of what we have there. Starting in verse 13 next week. Okay, thank you, everybody.